is a provision for, given the economic circumstances we're in, of perhaps a company not being able to pay. So there has been that amount set aside as well. But roughly $90 million is the cost of the program.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Ginger Sun. Hi there. I wanted to ask you, at a time when people are staying at home, they're using, more electricity, it makes sense to maybe offset some of those costs. By the same token, people are perhaps not driving as much, and so perhaps the driving risk goes down in terms of crashes. Is your government also looking at a similar type of program for ICBC?
Well, that's a good question. I know Minister Eby has been focused on ICBC since about 24 hours after he was sworn in and given the responsibility, and it has been an extraordinary task without COVID-19. I know that we're looking at an enhanced care model going forward. That's being developed right now so we can reduce costs for people, all classes of drivers, and that's the priority of the minister at this time. You will know that the cost of driving has decreased because of the cost of gasoline going down as well. Just around $1 a liter in British Columbia at the present time, the lowest it's been in recent memory for sure. So I don't believe we have any programs contemplated to reduce auto insurance costs as a result of COVID-19, but that's a good suggestion. I'll mention it to Minister Eby next time I talk to him.
Our next question comes from Lisa Cordasco.
Thank you. Forgive me if you've answered this already, but I just want to clarify that all customers, whether residential, small business, or large industrial, they will have to apply to BC Hydro for relief. And if that's the case, how soon can they apply? And how does it prove in case of individuals that they have been laid off or cannot help work because of COVID-19?
Over to Minister Ralston.
Thank you. Eligible residential customers will be able to apply by the end of next week, and small business customers will be able to apply starting the week of April 14th. And they'll have up to June 30th, 2020 to apply for bill relief. Eligible industrial customers can contact their key account manager. In terms of eligibility, the obvious eligibility for those who are laid off would be an application with EI, and then there's an effort going to be made to work with other agencies so that people can prove to the satisfaction of Hydro and that they are eligible. It's meant to be a process that will be flexible and efficient. Thank you very much. Certainly, in the Fortis service area, there are many customers in British Columbia. I have spoken with the CEO, Roger Montano of Fortis, and because Hydro is owned by the government, it's obviously a different relationship. Fortis is a private company, but they are interested and are following very closely the program that BC Hydro is putting forward. I've also spoken with the BC Utilities Commission, which regulates Fortis, and they have jurisdiction, an independent jurisdiction, over what Fortis might be obliged to do. So I understand that the BC Utilities Commission and Fortis are in discussion, and I'll await response. It may
concern. Minister Melanie Mark is reviewing that now with residents of universities and colleges. All of the lab work that needs to be done, it's not just in those practical applications of co-op programs, but there's hands-on work. There's many of Bachelor of Science degrees require intense laboratory work that has to be done under supervision within a confined area that's usually on campus. So these are challenges, but Mr. Mark was looking at that. It leads in, I think, to the broader approach that I'm taking with my colleagues with the government is to make sure that those ministers responsible for the various components of government operations, whether it be Bruce and his work on energy and BC Hydro, whether it be Minister Robinson with respect to housing and municipal affairs, Minister Farmer, and on it goes. I'm very confident in my team. I'm very confident that they are seized with making sure that we're providing services for people, always focusing on making sure that the things that government can provide, we will provide. We're going to keep monitoring these programs on a regular basis. If we need to add more, we will. Mr. James is working diligently to make sure we can contain all of the costs to the extent possible. But we're also hearing very clearly from the business community that from people that we can worry about the costs later. I'm not saying we'd be reckless here, but we need to make sure that people don't suffer unduly as a result of these issues. That includes getting that certificate, getting that diploma, getting that degree that people work so hard for, and in the last stages of their final year of these programs, to have this come down the bottom is a challenge. One that's not insurmountable. And I know the minister and those that are delivering the programs are working on that right now.
Thank you, everyone. That's all the time we have today.
I'm watching this again because I didn't hear the whole thing. So we'll go to Prince George Matters. Oh no.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We are going to start the press conference today with comments from Premier Morgan. We'll then move to Minister Ralston before going to questions from media. For reminder to media on the line, please press *1 to queue up now. Go ahead, Premier Morgan.
Thanks very much, Jen. And of course, I'm here on the Coastal Territory Province. We quoted this by both Southeast First Nations. Minister Ralston is in Vancouver on the territory of the Western Squamish Tsleil-Waututh. It is interesting to have a press conference this way with virtually empty press gallery here. I know Bruce has limited media present in Vancouver, but we're going to try and get through this as best we can. I want to acknowledge, of course, as I did last night, how proud I am of British Columbians who have stepped up and are acknowledging that they can play a role in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic by taking the directions that we've been getting from Dr. Ron Henry for some weeks now, and 100% commitment of British Columbians to do what we can to bend the curve. But for people who have lost their earnings as a result of COVID-19, there are significant challenges ahead. Today is April 1st. People are thinking about the bills they will receive in the coming months. One of those events.
Oops. Just wanted to comment. So, are you serious? 1%. I'm just kidding.
BC Hydro bill. So Minister Ralston and the government and BC Hydro are working on trying to bring forward policy reduce costs for people right now. And that means ensuring, of course, that we do our level best to apply for these programs only if we need them so that there is more resources available. Those who desperately need them. People who are out of work or had their wages reduced due to COVID-19, BC Hydro will be offering a 3-month credit on your power bill so you can focus on the things that matter to you most. For small businesses that have been forced to close, Hydro will be giving a 3-month payment holiday starting today, April 1st, so that when the crisis passes, you'll be in a better position to start up right away. And we've been hearing from large industries as well that their access to capital, their liquidity, their cash flow is a significant problem in these very challenging times. So BC Hydro will give the option to large industrial customers to have 50% of their payments deferred for the next 3 months, and that deferment will allow those businesses to continue operating and to continue to have people working in mines and other industrial projects across British Columbia, should they be abiding by the public health officer's rules and guidelines established with the Workers' Compensation Board to make sure that work sites are safe. In addition to that, today is April 1st, and the BC Utilities Commission has approved a 1% reduction across the board in all customer classes for BC Hydro customers, whether they're residents, a small business, or a large industrial user. I want to acknowledge the work that's been done by Mr. Ralston and the staff at BC Hydro to bring these programs forward so quickly. To have a holiday for small business for the next 3 months when it comes to electric bills, and we have credit on your bill as a residential customer if you've lost your wages or you lost your jobs and so forth. Our mission is to help make life easier once again. And during that time, I want to remind everyone to continue to practice physical distancing, continue to ensure if you don't need to leave your home, you don't, and of course, wash your hands as regularly as you possibly can. Be focused on getting well, being well, and helping those around you. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to Mr. Ralston, and thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ralston, please go ahead.
Thank you, Premier Horgan, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge as well that we're all here at our Vancouver Cabinet offices. We're on the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As the Premier just said, today we're announcing new relief on power bills to help homeowners and renters, small businesses, and major industries manage their expenses.
Difficult was really to a lot of people because I was certainly getting a lot of email from people wondering what hydro bills and if they were going to be reduced. So once again, the message is if people can continue paying the bills to do so, much like the message given to renters, if you can pay your rent, please do the responsible thing, pay the rent as it is April 1st, but the relief is also being made for others who find themselves again either out of work, unable to work because of COVID-19, and also on the hydro rebate as well. As Ralston said, all of this programs, sorry, programs announced earlier today is for people who lost employment, and that's a broadly defined category, and also others who are not working due to COVID-19. Doing a good job, an average job, not so great. If you want to, give the buzz line a call as well, 604-331-BUZZ. That is 604-331-2899, and we'd love to hear from you on that one if you have any concerns or you think there are other things that government should be doing. What else are you hearing from people? Well, Joe wrote to say 1% reduction rate in hydro, big deal. How does that even begin to offset a 100% revenue reduction for 90% of business owners and everybody else who has lost their job? So Joe says, no, it is not enough.
pills, or even a new CPAP machine to you with their free home delivery service. So call Inspire Sleep at 604-536-4353. That's 604-536-4353, or visit online at inspiresleep.ca for the lowest prices guaranteed.
For many of us, life as we know it has been put on pause. And while you've adapted your daily routine for the benefit of those around you, we've done the same. At Toyota, we understand that for some, mobility is a necessity. That's why we're doing everything we can to keep Canada moving forward, while respecting social distancing guidelines. To find out which priority services are available in your area, contact your local dealership.
This is the year to build and renovate. I'm Michael Tillman, Operations Supervisor at Fair Trade Works. Our team of professional construction managers will protect you from construction chaos.
What was I listening to?
Hands-on deck response.
These next 2 weeks will be absolutely critical because we know a surge is coming.
Premier Doug Ford says in this time of need, we can't count on global supply chains to produce medical equipment. That's why they're creating a $50 million fund for Ontario businesses to retool operations.
We need to mobilize Ontario's manufacturing money because there's nothing we can't make here in Ontario.
Ford also announced they've ordered 10,000 ventilators to be produced by the province's automotive industry. Brianna Carnegie, Global News.
Ontario reporting 426 new COVID-19 cases today, the largest number so far, including 4 more deaths. It's a spike of nearly 22% and a provincial total there of nearly 2,400 cases. Looks like another month before COVID-19 hits an apex in the hardest hit U.S. state.
Nearly 400 people have died of COVID-19 in New York since Tuesday. Governor Andrew Cuomo said the latest models now show an apex here at the end of April.
We're still on our way up the mountain.
At the top of the curve, if people comply with social distancing, Cuomo said the state would still need 75,000 hospital beds and 25,000 ventilators. To help with the compliance, Cuomo ordered playgrounds here in New York City to close. Parks remain open as long as there's distancing. Aaron Katursky, ABC News, New York.
It is pretty disappointing. That from Delta Police, who say thieves are targeting emergency vehicles over the past week or so.
It's a really frustrating crime. It's particularly upsetting to see someone targeting ambulances at this time.
Delta Police spokesperson Chris Lakoff says the crime happened sometime between the evening of March 26th and the morning of March 31st. She says the trio of ambulances were parked outside a business on Anasa's Island, waiting for maintenance. It appears a suspect cut a hole in the fence of the business.
After gaining access to the fenced area, the suspect then cut the catalytic converters off the ambulances.
Lakoff says it's concerning that those vehicles were targeted, especially when they're needed on the roads during the COVID-19 pandemic. She says if you have any information, call Delta Police. Aaron Newbelt, Global News.
Global News time 2:04. Latest AM 7:30 traffic. Here is Caitlin Ozanski.
Afternoon, it's going to be a busy one if you try to make your way through Coquitlam. There's a crash through the Colony Farm stretch along Logan Highway. It's eastbound at Pitt River Road, and this has eastbound traffic completely blocked. Use the Maryhill bypass as an alternate route. Heads up in Surrey, there's road work happening along 140 at the Fraser Highway. This is south and eastbound right turn lanes blocked in that area. Continue to 144, 148 as an alternate route. Save on Foods offers special shopping hours to better serve our seniors and most vulnerable customers. From 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. Save on Foods going the extra mile. In the AC30 Traffic Center, I'm Caitlin Olsensky. Brought to you by your local RE/MAX agents. Not sure where to start? Count on us. We've done this a million times. Visit RE/MAX.ca.
Google Sky Tracker weather, mix of sun and cloud this afternoon. Highs of 8, partly cloudy tonight. And like last night, a very good chance of showers or wet flurries overnight and into the morning. It'll feel chilly with a low down to 1. Cloudy tomorrow, chance of showers or wet flurries ongoing and a high of 8. Extended forecast, mix of sun and cloud with some moisture mixed in on Friday. Rain on Saturday and just a chance of showers on Sunday, high 7 to 9. In Oregon, it's cloudy and 9 and outside CKNW at Pacific Center. We're at 8 degrees. On the market, Dow Jones down 973. The TSX in Toronto down 516. Our Canadian dollar 7.34 cents US. Global News time 4:06. I'm Terry Shields. Now, back to the June Bennett Show.
All right, so you've likely been hearing in the news some people with pre-existing conditions, health conditions that have nothing to do with COVID-19 have had difficulties filling their prescriptions because of talk of these drugs helping treat the coronavirus. One of the drugs, you might never have heard of it before, hydroxychloroquine, has become in short supply in some cases. And we're hearing stories like this right across the country. So we're going to talk to somebody who has used this drug and depends on this drug to deal with her lupus. And Florence, too, joins me on the line to talk a bit more about this. Florence, thanks so much for taking some time with us today. So how much, maybe back up a little bit and tell us a little bit about what you take hydroxychloroquine for.
I think hydroxychloroquine for the symptoms. I have situations and I've worked experience with patients with people
And so you depend on it, then I imagine, too. What happens then? What would your condition be like when you take it? And what's the whole deal with your drug then as far as prescriptions being filled? Now, we've heard stories across the country of people in very similar situations calling a pharmacy, asking to get the prescription, and in some cases, pharmacists are telling the people that they run out of the drug, they've been unable to order more.
I can only sit in that chair for so long. Hey there, little buddy. How you doing?
I immediately texted the office to ask if there was an issue moving the medication. right away, and additionally, and turn up at the end of March, and that was okay, but I'm not even for that budget for you.
No, absolutely not. Because yeah, we are hearing some other stories of people, pharmacists just saying it's not, they don't have it in stock. Have you been told at all that in the future that there might be more of a difficulty getting the drug, or you have a pretty safe supply?
I have a pretty safe supply, and hospitals has assured me that they are working hard to make sure that I have all the medications I need on stock. So I'm not making too much money, but the agents will change in the future. But as for now, I'm pretty secure supply.
And what do you think about what's happening in that it's not as though this is an approved drug at this point for COVID-19, but there has been talk about it, so there's been such a run on this.
And anybody would be happy to hear about what they are actually doing. But the thing is, very out of
Absolutely. And I mean, it's coming out of the States mainly, I think. The President of the United States talked about this. He's tweeted about this, saying that they're approving it, and they're actually encouraging people to use a combination of drugs to have COVID-19. So it makes sense that that's also the message is being heard in Canada as well. Are there any side effects that you experience when you take this drug? And it's got to be frustrating too. I mean, this is something that even the World Health Organization has put on the list of essential medicines, treating not only lupus, your condition, but also rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, there are a lot of people that depend on this drug. Absolutely. Well, I'm glad to hear that you were able to get your prescription and that you have safe supply. And as we mentioned, unfortunately, there are others out there that don't have that. Lawrence, thank you so much for taking some time. Great to talk with you today. All right, Florence 2 is uses the drug hydroxychloroquine.
There hasn't been a loss of infrastructure. So it's not like we've lost power and we've had infrastructure destroyed or wrecked. So that's a really good positive. Right. The concern, though, is that the traffic patterns have changed. So people aren't at work, they're at home, and the traffic follows where the people are. And so the trick is, how do you handle the fact that where the traffic is moving to and from has changed? So that's the concern.
And so how do they handle what happens when where the people are has changed?
Yeah, so some of it has happened gradually. For example, streaming services are very common now. They weren't, say, 10 years ago. And so some of the local infrastructure has been beefed up in order to handle this streaming services. And so, it's very predictable how people use the streaming service. Everyone's home after school and after work, and then they start using the services, and it grows, and then they go to bed, and then it shrinks. And so there's a certain amount of capacity that's just built in. The issue is that there's much more of it happening. There's more people competing within the households for this. And what's happening is that there's new congestion points. So probably the ones that are happening the most is the ones where houses are fed together into larger pipes to allow the traffic to flow. And those pipes are getting congested. And it isn't an easy problem in that, yes, you can add more infrastructure, but it does take time. So some of the remedies are to add spare capacity that you may have or spare parts. You can increase a little bit of capacity. And some of it is to take traffic that you want to prioritize and give it the priority over other traffic. The problem with that piece is that who prioritizes what traffic?
Yes. And that can be fraught and political as well.
I think so. And I'm sure there's discussions happening at the service providers on how best to do this. And there'd be some places that would be worse than others. The other pressure point would be at the other end of the network, which is the content providers. So the streaming services and maybe more importantly, these video services that are being used much, much more than they have in the past. And so they may not also have sufficient traffic to handle this amount of traffic at the times that they're happening.
Right.
So I think both ends of the network will be stressed right now.
I'm Nora Young, and this time on Spark, we're talking technology and access. With so many people working and learning from home, how are our networks coping with all that traffic? My guest right now is Mark Wolf. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Canary, which maintains the network used by academic institutions and scientific research facilities to share data. So where you work, Canary maintains Canada's national research and education network. So can you describe what that is?
Yes. So the National Research and Education Network is a partnership between provincial networks that connect to colleges and universities and science instruments, etc., computer systems. So this is in provinces and in territories, and Canary is the national partner for this. And so we connect between provinces and between international points. And every country has a similar research and education network, and we all connect together. This allows research traffic primarily, but also educational traffic to traverse the globe. So for the benefit of science, including research being done right now on Covid-19.
So your work involves maintaining network services and high-speed connections among Canada's research community. It's hard to think of a time when that's more important than now. What's your job been like the last few weeks?
Yeah, so lots of preparation, both at Canary and with our partners to make sure that everything works. And so that extends internationally. So we've been having lots of conference calls, lots of making sure that we have contingency plans in place, making sure that the people that operate the networks are safe. Nothing unusual compared to what everyone else is doing, but we have the same sense of urgency that others do. And so we know that we're a very critical part of this. And so we're working very hard to maintain our services.
And as education shifts to being online, are you expecting to have more challenges?
Well, it's interesting. We're still trying to figure out what that looks like, and I think the institutions are as well. So I mentioned at the beginning that networks were very physical. So the Research and Education Network connects to the schools and to those facilities. But if the students aren't at the schools, you're going to see different traffic patterns. The network is still very much in use. It's just not used for some of the things that we would normally.
I mean, I'm sure it's a busy and stressful time for everyone working in internet infrastructure right now. But do you think at the end of all this, there might be something good that comes out of it in terms of like learning about how to respond to when things change very quickly?
Yeah, so it's a big question for sure. I had a colleague say it this way, that working from home was sort of a luxury that we use sometimes. At Canary, we recognize that working from home had some advantages, so we've been working from home 1 or 2 days a week for a couple of months now, and so we were able to transition very well. But for a lot of people, it's not part-time. It's a necessity. It's not a luxury. It's a necessity to do this. And so I think that this is here to stay, this being able to work from home, work remotely. And I think we're going to look more and more at our connected world and how we can be more flexible in where people work and how they work.
Are there ways that individuals can manage their own internet use to help make sure that the broader network doesn't get overwhelmed?
I'm sure there'd be some service providers that would love to phone me right now and tell me what they'd like to say, but there certainly is some uses of the networks that take more traffic. So, for example, first-person games or real-time games that are data intensive, those are taxing on the system, and so there hasn't been too much talk of that in North America, but I know in Europe that there has been calls for reducing the fidelity of those games. This is true also for things like streaming services, reducing the fidelity of it. But it's a balance between taking things away, but also giving people some hope.
Mark, thanks so much for your insights on this.
Well, thank you, Nora.
Mark Wolf is the Chief Technology Officer for Canary. They maintain the network connecting universities, colleges, and research facilities across Canada. Spark Archives 2012.
I'm Andrew Blum. I'm a journalist and author in New York City. It snuck up on us as a really dominant part of our lives. A lot of the pieces of the internet were built, and there was this huge news story in the kind of 98-2002 period. And then all these companies went bust and bankrupt, and there was all sorts of corruption and things. But the internet was kind of built. And then journalists, I know in particular, forgot about it. It wasn't a story anymore. It was a big story, and then it wasn't a story at all. And so the physical piece of it was built before it became so dominant in our lives. We have no idea that the internet has parts and pieces. We assume it's a cloud. We assume it's this holistic thing. As we use more and more bandwidth, and as we depend more and more on the internet for things like watching TV, we'll want to know more about the parts and pieces that make it up.
This is Spark.
This is Spark.
You're listening to Spark.
Spark.
You're listening to Spark.
From CBC Radio.
I'm Nora Young, this is Spark, and today we're talking about digital tech and access. With people staying home as much as possible, access to devices and the internet has never seemed more important for work, learning, important information, but also for the social connection that's so important to mental health. Earlier we heard about the pressure on the physical internet now that so many people are staying home. Pressure is actually a good word to describe so much of what's happening right now in the home. Pressure to work from home, even though there may be two of you there trying to work at the same time. You may live in tight quarters, so you're working in the exact same space. There may be a child or three, and they're expected to keep up their studies online. But how does all that happen if you only have one computer in the home? There are tons of recent articles about how to work from home. Heck, we did a whole show about it last week. But most of the focus has been on the individual. There's little to no information about how to manage a family that suddenly needs to be online to work and study at the same time, let alone with only one laptop. And then there's the digital divide. Despite how ultra-connected the world may seem, it's important to remember that many families don't have reliable internet access, capable smartphones, or multiple devices to make working and schooling from home viable. In 2018, I spoke to Nisa Mali. Back then, she had just co-authored a report on digital literacy in Canada.
So about 86% of Canadians have access to broadband internet in their home, but the speeds that they have access to and the cost of that internet varies drastically across the country. 59% of people that are living in rural areas don't have access to speeds that meet CRT standards. 25% of Canadians across the country don't even have 10 megabytes per second, which is a bare bones speed that they would struggle to watch a video on YouTube. Even if you have a home device
device, it's not always the most modern. It doesn't always have the most up-to-date software, and those low-income people in Canada tend to be working with older equipment and without access to some of the newer updates.
Right now, in our current situation, students are expected to keep up with schooling on apps and Google Classroom. But those who don't have access to reliable devices run the risk of falling behind.
There are so many people throughout the country, even in urban areas, that don't have the internet at home, that are reliant on schools, libraries, Wi-Fi hotspots at coffee shops and Tim Hortons, trying to figure out how to make it work. And for a really long time, I think those families have found ways to bridge that gap that makes the digital divide a little bit more invisible.
This is Laura Try.
I am the executive director at Open Media. We do grassroots advocacy to ensure that the internet remains open, affordable, and surveillance free. And we do a lot of campaigning and policy work at municipal, provincial, and federal levels to make sure that everyone has guaranteed access to the internet. I am sitting in my closet. I have a lot of clothes and blankets around me, and I'm recording this over Google Meet and also on voice notes on my iPhone.
In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, most internet service providers in Canada have temporarily removed usage limits on home internet to make it easier for people to do their work and schooling while observing social distance. That's a pretty big deal, considering we have expensive internet plans and low data caps. So I asked Laura what this decision means for users.
I think for users, it's a really great step. It takes away the pressure of trying to monitor what you're doing at home for how long, particularly when people are now faced with additional stresses of trying to work from home, entertain and educate kids from home, and figure out how to navigate the entire world from the confines of their living room. So taking away that pressure is a really big step to make sure that people can get access to the information that they need.
But I guess the question is, if these limits can be lifted at will, how necessary is it to have them in the first place?
I think it's really interesting to see that something that has been argued for so long by the ISPs as necessary to maintain and control traffic can actually be taken away during the highest traffic times that we have. And for years, Open Media has been arguing that data caps are a way to limit and control usage of the internet. And I think what we've seen now, when they're removed during peak usage, is that they are unnecessary, that there's something that is used to try and control how we use the internet and how much we use, and tell us what we should or shouldn't be seeing. But ultimately, there are other ways to manage traffic online, and people are using this to access things that they need. This isn't just sort of optional fun entertainment, which is fine as well, but that this is actually an essential service that people need.
So we're recording this interview on March 26th, and as of now, data caps haven't been lifted for mobile internet use, although some telecoms have waived long-distance and roaming charges. Is that significant?
That's huge, and I think that's actually the biggest shift that we need to see in the next days and weeks to come. When we're looking at the people who need data caps lifted the most, it's the people who don't have home internet. If I'm at home right now recording this interview, I don't want to use my cell phone data cap to record these things. Even if my data cap was lifted, my home internet is faster. So there's no risk or use of me abusing my cell phone data because I have a faster connection at home, and I'm privileged to have that. But when we look at the lower income communities in Canada, what we've seen statistically is that they are far more likely to be forced to choose between home internet and a cell phone. And when they do, they choose a cell phone because it gives them a phone number, which is critical. It gives them freedom and flexibility to move around as needed. And they often can't afford a laptop or a separate device that would be needed to make home internet work. And so when we're working now to try and see how to exist when everything's online, we're trying to operate in a world where work and schooling and information are all so prevalent on the internet. The people that are not connected are really the ones who are going to suffer the most. And the best way to bridge that gap is to remove data caps on cell phones.
So then more broadly, how does the current situation contribute to the discussion of digital divides in Canada?
I think that at the end of all of this, we're going to see a really big shift in people's understanding of what that digital divide looks like and what it means. In the same way that I don't think anyone is ever going to question the value of a stay-at-home parent again, seeing what happens, I don't think anyone's going to question the value of the internet after this. and not just in terms of what it means for connectivity to work or school, but really the role that it plays in connecting people. And there are a lot of communities that I think have been taken for granted or overlooked in how the digital divide impacts them. And I think right now, when people are forced to reconcile with how necessary connectivity in your home is, but also what it looks like when people are fundamentally on or off, I think it will really sharpen that digital divide. I think it will bring it into focus for decision makers, for policymakers, teachers, students, parents, understanding what that discrepancy looks like in a way that I think is going to have some really negative consequences in the short term as people are left behind, but hopefully can have some really positive policy outcomes at the end of this to make sure we bridge that gap sooner than later.
And certainly we're seeing the perhaps hidden value of these kind of prosthetics in a way, right? Like the role that libraries play in giving people greater connectivity, or the ability to sit down at a fast food restaurant and use their Wi-Fi, which of course we're not doing now.
Good afternoon. Here are the headlines from the CBC Vancouver newsroom. I'm Tim Weeks. We'll soon have new statistics concerning the coronavirus in BC. The province reported 43 new cases of COVID-19 yesterday. That brought the provincial total to 1,013, including 24 people who have died. The results of more testing will be released at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Meanwhile, Premier John Horgan has extended the state of emergency in BC because of the pandemic. He urged people to continue with physical distancing, saying what people do today will affect what healthcare workers face in the days ahead. The city of Vancouver is warning that it's seeing a spike in overdose deaths. From March 23rd to the 29th, police were called to 8 overdose deaths. That's the highest in a single week since August of 2019. Health officials say the drug supply remains toxic, with contaminants and additives like fentanyl. They say it's a reminder that BC is struggling with 2 epidemics, the COVID-19 pandemic and the drug crisis. And a recent theft has left many people shaking their heads. Delta police say they took a report last night of catalytic converters being stolen from 3 ambulances. They say converters are often taken by metal thieves, but investigators say this is a time when no area can afford to have 3 ambulances taken off the road. In the weather, a few showers or even the occasional flurry today with a high of 9. The odd shower tomorrow with the highs holding at 9 degrees.
I'm Nora Young, this is Spark. Today we're talking about access and how the current public health crisis is highlighting the digital divide that exists within our communities. Those who can get online from home and those who don't have that option. Right now I'm speaking with Laura Tribe, whose work with Open Media promotes open, affordable internet for everyone. So what would you say is the biggest obstacle in the way of making the internet just a basic service in Canada?
So in 2016, the CRTC ruled that the internet is a basic service, that everyone should have access to it. In 2019, so 3 years later, the federal government announced that by 2030, every single person in Canada should have access to high-speed internet. And that's a ways away. That's 14 years after the CRTC decided it. And so I think that in our heads, we know it's critical. I think that there are some challenges in how to build that infrastructure, and there are some policy challenges. So we've seen a lot of different approaches to how that infrastructure should actually be built. There are areas, including rural, remote, and northern areas in Canada, where we have waited for so long for companies to build there. We have waited for the investment to be seen as worthwhile and to let market forces bring them the internet. And in some areas, the cost of building it there is greater than those companies will ever recuperate through the sales they're able to make to that community. And that's really where we need to see the government step in. And that's something that has taken a while. The government's policy direction has been to basically let market forces prevail, and they haven't. And so when it comes to infrastructure, we're going to need to see significant investment from the government to make sure that those communities are brought online and in the way that they want to. So particularly when it comes to Canada's Indigenous communities, many of those communities are not looking for a company to come serve them. They would like the ability to build their own networks, but they need the funding to do so. And so I think figuring out how to navigate that process has taken a really long time. When it comes to areas like urban centers that already have the infrastructure available, it's an affordability question. It's really making sure that if it is a basic service, we are finding ways through subsidies, through affordable plans, that every single household has a right to a guaranteed minimum basic service quality. And I think that's something that is critical, but is a big policy decision and change to put into place that the government hasn't been quick to jump on just yet.
So we have those two separate issues. One is the actual sort of technical infrastructure issues to remote and northern communities, and then the other is the lower income households. I know that there's this broadcast fund that has $750 million dedicated to try to help bring infrastructure to remote and northern communities. So what's happening with that?
We are seeing applications go in for that funding, but we haven't really seen money come rolling out the door, let alone the actual shovels in the ground to make sure that that connectivity is happening. And again, I think that's a real demonstration of how slow these policies are moving. And that's the nature of a regulator and the nature of government, I understand. But fundamentally, when we're saying this is a basic service, we need to prioritize that. And open media has been saying this for years, that we need to bridge the digital divide, and we hear a lot of agreement from those in power. And yet, when something like the COVID-19 pandemic hits, we really see what happens when you don't prioritize it. We see how far people are being left behind.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to lower income households who maybe, technically the ability is there, but there's an affordability problem, I thought the CRTC was pushing ISPs to come up with kind of more of a minimum lightweight package that would be affordable. Do you know what's happening with that?
So we saw on cell phone plans in particular a push for low cost data only plans 2 years ago or a year ago that were put into place that were encouraging a more affordable option. But what we ended up seeing was plans that were per gigabyte 10 times more expensive than some of their larger plans. It's really a way to gouge low income and more affordable users for their data usage. So unfortunately, and the CRTC is currently investigating what they want to do with the wireless market. We just had a hearing in February around the review of wireless services. The CRTC's decision is still forthcoming. What we are advocating for is a plan that is available to anyone who needs it. When it comes to a lot of the work the CRTC has done, they have encouraged providers to make options available, and what we end up seeing is they are very limited in who's able to access them. So examples would include you have to live in subsidized housing to qualify for those plans. Well, there are a lot of people who actually would qualify otherwise, but haven't actually been able to get access to subsidized housing and could be in even greater need, but aren't eligible. And so ultimately, what we believe is that those plans need to be available to anyone. There shouldn't be a specific criteria because so often they don't take into consideration the circumstances. But fundamentally, the CRTC continues to leave it in the hands of the incumbent providers to decide what they think is feasible and what they think is best, instead of setting an expectation for what people deserve.
I see. So obviously not much can be done in terms of building infrastructure right at this moment. Do you have any tips on optimizing internet use, within households with multiple devices?
Yeah, we've been pretty lucky. For the most part, Canada's networks have held up. And I think it really goes to show that there is a more robust infrastructure than maybe our data caps are indicating. We're so often told that they can't keep up, and yet here we are fairly well keeping up with maximum use. But there are some people who are reporting slowdowns. Suddenly you have 3, 4, 5 devices connected where you were only used to having one previously. So I would say the first thing to do is just be mindful of what needs to be connected to the internet when. If you have kids at home and you're trying to download programming for them to watch instead of streaming it live at the same time as your video call for work at the same time in the middle of the day, if you can download some of those Netflix programs the night before, depending on the services you're using, a lot of them do let you download them to the device. So you're not using all of your internet bandwidth at the same time, which means your video calls will come in clearer, your movies will still stream for the kids, and just simplifies that. The other thing to do is just, if you have any major downloads, it's a good time for gaming right now. It's a good time for software updates. Do all of those overnight. It'll just slow down things a little bit less and make sure that at off-peak hours, not just your internet, but the internet of your neighbors is not being bombarded at the same time.
Good advice. And what about more broadly? Are there things that can be done to share internet access kind of among larger communities while still practicing social distancing?
Yeah, we're really looking at figuring out some options for what can be done for those who don't have access to the internet and how we can find ways to get there. But one of the really simple things that people can do, we're talking about going to get groceries for neighbors and check in on them. Check if they have the internet. If not, maybe this is the time to consider sharing your Wi-Fi, making sure that if you have an extra device lying around that would help someone who doesn't have one, they could borrow it. There are definitely security risks that come with opening up your Wi-Fi and sharing devices, but if it's someone that you know or you think that you can manage that in a way that you trust, I think it's really a good time to consider how do we share the resources that we have. And I think now more than ever, the internet is a really big resource that we have, and we need to make sure we're sharing.
Mm-hmm. Can you set up hotspots like at schools where people could be maintaining a certain amount of distance, like not going into the building, but still accessing the internet that way?
There have been calls from the FCC, the federal regulator in the states, for them to be implementing hotspots at schools. It's something that we're talking to different groups to explore what's possible here in Canada. Libraries, hotspots, schools as hotspots, anything that is a public space. The concern that we've heard so far is, will people respect the social distancing? But there are definitely ways that we can get those hotspots set up and active. As well as some of the Wi-Fi hotspot rocket sticks that are on lend from libraries at times. How do we get those into the hands of people who need them? So we're going to continue to talk to teachers, students, municipalities around what can be done. We have seen some of the public Wi-Fi hotspots in major cities like Vancouver being opened up so that populations who are more at risk, that don't have home internet, do have a way to connect with the devices that they have. So we're trying to figure out different ways to do that. But that's definitely something that if you have the ability to share, if you have Wi-Fi, even in restaurants and coffee shops that are closed, if the Wi-Fi can stay on for people who are outside, that's a little thing that goes a really long way for someone who doesn't have connectivity at home.
Mm-hmm. Laura, thanks so much for your insights on this.
Thanks for having me.
Laura Tribe is the Executive Director of Open Media.
This is a kind of wholesale refiguring of how most of us engage in social activities for pleasure and how we work together and how we get sort of the business of life done, how to, get to work, how to get their groceries, how to, communicate with the teachers at the school. All of it has become social media now, and that's a real context collapse for people.
This is Amy Morrison.
I'm an associate professor of English at the University of Waterloo. And I am sitting in my home office in the top corner of my house, recording this onto the voice memo function of my iPhone.
In and out of isolation, Amy researches how people represent themselves online. So naturally, she was the first person I thought of to explore how that self-representation changes in a crisis like our current one.
If you think about it, this is exactly the type of scenario that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency of the United States originally developed the internet for. I mean, they were thinking of a nuclear war that would sort of disrupt communication and break up institutions and structures that manage everyday life. And the internet was kind of designed to be able to survive some type of large-scale disaster and allow people to continue to communicate with each other. I mean, the thinking then was that, the generals in the sort of hidden in the mountain in Colorado could discuss things with the politicians hidden in the bunker in Washington, right? But it turns out all of us need to communicate with each other, even in times where we cannot be physically proximate. And so the internet is right there. And it was always designed to be able to do this for us. We just never imagined it would be on such a scale by such a wide proportion of the population. So it actually doesn't surprise me very much.
And one of the things that I found interesting, I'd be curious to get your reaction to, is just how people's use varies by platform. In terms of how they're adapting their self-presentation. Instagram, as usual, features lovely inspirational images, for example. Have you noticed anything about the ways that people are using different platforms?
Yeah, I would say there's a lot. People are trying to process in real time the new ways of doing things. So there's a lot of hashtags now related to working from home, which has, many of us work from home most of the time, but a vast proportion of the population does not work from their homes. And so that new situation has prompted a lot of new hashtags that you see on Instagram, people's home office setups that are highly aestheticized. And I just saw on Twitter, someone sent me an image of work from home. It's a man at a desk, and then behind him, you can see his children duct taped to the floor. So I think, Instagram is going to be like, if you move your potted plants over here, your feng shui is going to be great. And, if you use this filter, it's going to look fantastic. And on Twitter, they're like, you may have to tape your children to the floor to get any work done. And on Facebook, it's a little bit different again, right? So every medium kind of leans a little bit more into what it already did.
Mm-hmm. I'm always struck by how even in a crisis, people will respond with humor, with memes, and so on. Have you seen that play out in social spaces online in the last few weeks, specifically around memes and humor?
Oh my gosh, I would say Zoom, the video conferencing platform, has produced so many jokes. Because this is a technology that some people have been using for a while. It would be like, if you woke up tomorrow and the only communication channel left you was TikTok, right? Like TikTok would have a whole bunch of new users on it who don't really know what they're doing. So I would say there's a huge amount of sort of internet humor being produced around, people who can't get their Zoom to work correctly, or people who are, getting wild backgrounds. I've seen a lot of memes being creative of like, what I look like when the Zoom call is audio only versus what I look like when the Zoom call is on video, or, it'll show a split view of like the top half of somebody who's on camera, it's like all done up, or the bottom half is like sort of in their underwear or in pajamas or something. So there's a lot of joking about that, which I find is really funny because video conferencing turns out to be an essential part of maintaining business as usual for a lot of people who are working from home, where they had to go to a lot of meetings. And when they're not used to doing it, they are looking to others for cues on how they're supposed to behave. So I think we're building a set of social norms around how to work from home with some of these memes that look on the face of it just kind of funny, but are actually trying to cue us into emerging social norms around appropriate behavior.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, we're connecting over video chat, and I accidentally sent you the link to a virtual cocktail party that I was setting up for Friday night. So I'm actually part of the people who are learning to use these tools properly. In fact, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that everybody has a little bit of a sense of humor about this and a little bit of patience with one another as we develop it.
Mm-hmm. So what role do you think memes and humor play just in managing our emotions in a kind of rapidly changing situation like this?
I think it's a way when we, post a funny meme. Like I've been doing work from home tweets today about my coworkers are talking too loudly, but my coworkers are my husband and my daughter, and they're in different parts of the house and they're talking to themselves, right? And it sort of mimics a workplace, and people are having a little bit of fun with that online. And I see a lot of tweets about that where people are kind of gently expressing some of the difficulties that this big social change has made for them without, sort of being really vulnerable. Like, I hate everybody in my house and I have to get out of here. People are being like just a little bit more gentle and a little bit funnier, and sort of finding a way to produce a little bit of internet joy for somebody else in crafting a tweet. It can help you feel a little bit more reconciled to your own experience, or begin to see the humor in your own situation, because you're able to reach out to people who are outside of your sort of self-isolating household where you're, not supposed to go out, and if you do, you're supposed to stay 6 feet away from everybody, right? So I think this kind of participation in something that is lighthearted and silly and fun, and that helps us understand that we're all kind of going through this together, not in the Titanic is currently sinking and we're all on it sort of way, but like maybe someday we will laugh about this, right? And maybe that day could be today a little bit, right?
Toronto's medical officer of health, Arlene Davila, has attracted a lot of attention for her scarves, which is one thing that I've noticed. There's even a Twitter account that's dedicated to her scarf game and how excellent it is. And I just find there's something specifically delightfully internety about that kind of sort of playfulness of taking this very serious situation and finding something to just be totally goofy about in the midst of.
Yeah, I mean, like the tendency is if you're just reading like the headlines that pop up in your newsfeed, it's like doom, gloom, unprecedented, historical, right? It all feels incredibly heavy and incredibly serious. But like this woman who's telling us all this news, like has a great scarf game, and like if we can focus, I mean, this is what a lot of the sort of pieces coming out now about how to quell your COVID anxiety say, like focus on it right now, right? And so when we take delight in somebody's ever shifting but always fabulous scarf game, we're sort of becoming present, right? This is an anxiety quelling strategy that they will also teach you in therapy, is focus on a specific detail, right? Just focus on that, catch your breath, get back to it. So when we do these sorts of things, or there's the meme about Anthony Fauci's, face palm heard around the world in that Trump press conference. If people are taking little bits of very human sort of actions that we can all relate to on an individual and personal level as a way of dealing with our anxieties about something that feels like global in scale, it's not something that as an individual person I feel confident that I have any control over or agency in, but I am, quite qualified to talk about people's scarves, right? Or the quality of people's pets or their Zoom backgrounds, or like which meme is the funniest. It feels human sized, and the rest of this feels so much bigger than that it's terrifying.
Yeah. I'm Nora Young, and this is Spark. My guest right now is Amy Morrison. We're talking about the delightful, complicated, troubling, and goofy ways we're connecting online to deal with physical distance. As you suggested, people are adapting to a lot of new social rules, a lot of norms, how to practice social distancing, most obviously. So what role do these kind of online social spaces play in helping us build new norms?
I think it's been very interesting for me to watch right now. So maybe you've heard about Brady Sluder. He's a young man from Ohio who went on a spring break trip with his bros to Miami Beach and had the misfortune for his own self to be interviewed by Network News. And he said, well, I'm here, we've been planning this for a long time, 2 months. And he's like, when it comes down to it, I'm not going to stop partying, right? He's like, if I get Corona, I get Corona. And he sort of became the kind of exemplar of this like Gen Z inattention to the actual risks. And the backlash against him was so strong that actually he's come out with an Instagram apology, right? Where he's not said like, I'm just one guy, don't take it out on me. He said like, I hear what you're saying, and what I said was insensitive. I don't want you to forgive me. I want you to know I'm going to try to be better. So in some ways, by sharing these examples, it works the same way gossip has always worked. It sort of says, look at this person. We don't agree with this behavior. We need to do better, right? And in this case, the young man in question was able to sort of learn from that experience and say, yeah, actually, if I had to do it again, I wouldn't. And I'm being much more careful now, and everyone should be more careful, right? So I think, we can't be in groups and take our cues from each other person to person, but we can take our cues from each other from what we see on the internet.
Yeah. I mean, there's an obvious role for technology in keeping friends and family together. I find I'm really valuing group chats on WhatsApp, for instance. But what about for people who are more socially isolated? Do you think that there's value in following people in sort of open platforms like Twitter and Instagram, even if you don't know these people? Is there a social support there?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think for people particularly who are feeling isolated, I would recommend that their internet time is probably better spent following people whose posts delight them, right, rather than following more news channels, because the news channels will just scare you and make you feel even more isolated. But it is possible to sort of lurk on the sidelines of social life through various kinds of open social media platforms online. I think it's a low cost sort of bandwidth mentally, emotionally, to join social life at a distance like that, particularly for people who don't feel very well connected to start with.
Mm-hmm. I find it been interesting uses of technology in community building as this kind of information bridge. For instance, there's a Facebook group that's designed to connect seniors and people who are self-isolating with help. And then there are also posters up around the neighborhood, in my neighborhood at least, telling people about the Facebook group. There's this kind of way in which the physical and the digital are sort of braiding together in interesting ways. Have you noticed anything like that?
Right. So now there's like telephone poles that direct you to join a Facebook group, or it used to be like Facebook events would get blasted out to get you to go to something in real space, right? Like that's kind of an interesting inversion. And that feels like a really good way to feel as if we are acting as a community, even if we cannot be together, right, in physical space. So neighborhoods are keeping in touch as neighborhoods, or where sort of Facebook groups around, certain types of interests or capacities around helping. Like I know there's been a lot of chatter online about people with sewing skills making fabric masks, right? And even though the effectiveness of those are not proven, people were so desperate to feel like they were doing something together that could advance our collective goals of getting through this pandemic, that those groups grew incredibly fast, right? People really do want to feel as though they are participating in something bigger, but doing so on a scale that feels human and manageable to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Amy, it strikes me that social media, as we know, has had kind of a bad rap for the last few years. But do you think that now we're in this moment of kind of rediscovering the value in social media and in these social networking spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope so. I just saw an article this morning. I took a screen grab and I shared it. It was an article about how to ease loneliness during self-isolation. And it, begins with this, like, since the beginning of time, people have always gathered in groups because we are deeply social creatures and it's important to our humanity. But then came the internet, right? And then the next part of the paragraph is like, but then came the internet and we all gave up being social. And so even before the pandemic came, we were in a crisis of loneliness. And I was like, well, that's a weird flex, right? Because actually people have always found community in online spaces, right? Some of us prefer to meet in person and some of us prefer to make jokes on Twitter and see who responds, right? And so now when a lot of people no longer have that luxury of defaulting to in-person socialization, are getting the opportunity to see just how deep a connection you can maintain or forge with people through online means, right? So like you, I've been having sort of like FaceTime or Zoom or Skype cocktail parties with people. We all agree we're going to put on some lipstick and make ourselves a drink and listen to some music and hang out, which isn't something I would have done before, but certainly I'm still engaging a lot of people on Facebook and on Twitter and through my Instagram, and that always felt like real friendship and real social connection. And right now it's my only form of friendship and social connection. And so I hope that people who are maybe not so habituated to socializing in those ways will allow themselves to be open to the different types of possibilities that those platforms provide for us.
Can we talk a little bit about the politics of digital access? I mean, how do we see that play out at this moment when access to tools, and not just the tools, but also the digital literacy and the comfort with digital tools are so important?
Yeah, I think this is a really crucial question. We tend to think, because, almost everybody has a smartphone in their pocket, that now we've all somehow become digital natives. And just because I know how to filter an image on my Instagram, I'm going to know how to set up a secure video link, right? That's not the case. So when we move into online only, work from home, school from home situation, the mistake that many of us make is thinking that that's going to be a one-to-one transference, right? Like I'm going to pick everything up out of my office or everything up out of the classroom, and I'm just going to do it from my home, and it's going to be exactly the same. Well, it's not. So many people, when they go back into their home spaces, they don't have a dedicated private space that they can do their work in. Or maybe, like at my home, I've had to kick everybody in the house off the internet so I can talk to you right now and get some decent sound quality. Or, people are subject to sort of limits of their Wi-Fi. They're subject to, like, maybe they have like a 5-year-old Chromebook in their house that it's like the battery doesn't last on it, or maybe there's only 2 computers but 4 people who live in the house, or maybe their work really depends on getting things printed a lot and they don't have a printer in their home, or maybe they work with a headset and they don't have the headset at home, or they're being asked to download a lot of new kinds of software that they don't know how to set up and troubleshoot by themselves without sort of the corporate IT guy at their elbow, right? I think we've not really paid enough attention to the kind of hardware and software literacy demands and just actual practical material demands of having a certain amount of equipment and bandwidth available to you in your house. And people are really struggling with that.
Yeah, and I think there's also this kind of particularly regrettable thing that's coming now where there's, an elitism or a snob kind of thing around people who don't have perhaps as many digital skills, where there's sort of shaming or making people feel like, why don't you have the latest thing because you ought to? It's really unfortunate.
When we send people away from where all of the resources and supports are, it's kind of unfair to demand that, in addition to being good at whatever it is you're supposed to do, now you also have to be your own IT department, your own HR department, your own employee assistance plan, your own cafeteria, that you're supposed to suddenly become good at all these other things that you were supported in before.
Yeah. Amy, thanks so much. I appreciate your insights on this.
Oh, thank you so much.
Amy Morrison is an associate professor at the University of Waterloo in Ontario. You've been listening to Spark. The show is made by Michelle Parisi, Adam Killick, Ozzy Sarakana, and me, Nora Young. And by Mark Wolf, Laura Tribe, and Amy Morrison. And from the Spark Archives, a 2019 interview with Nicole Staroselsky, a 2012 interview with Andrew Blum, and a 2018 interview with Lisa Molly. Go to cbc.ca/spark to subscribe to the podcast or download the free CBC Listen app. And you can find us on Facebook and Twitter where we are Spark CBC. I'm Nora Young. Hang in there. Talk to you soon.
You are listening to CBC Radio 1 in British Columbia. You can also listen to us on the CBC Listen app and the CBC News app.
I'm Stephen Quinn. Hour by hour, minute by minute, the news surrounding COVID-19 is changing. New restrictions and closures, limits on travel, efforts to stop the spread of the virus, and the economic impact. Every weekday on the Early Edition, we'll be here with the latest news, answers to your questions, and the best and latest information on how to keep your family safe and healthy. That's the Early Edition beginning at 5 a.m. right here on CBC Radio 1.
I hope you'll stay with us for On the Coast. We'll bring in today's live COVID-19 provincial update in a moment. Following that, we'll explore some privacy concerns over the Zoom teleconferencing app. And we want to hear from frontline workers. How are you coping and what can we do to support you?
This is CBC News from Vancouver. Good afternoon, I'm Robert Zimmerman. BC health officials are about to start their daily coronavirus update. We will get to that as soon as it begins. Meanwhile, the provincial government has announced people whose jobs have been affected by the coronavirus crisis will be given a credit for 3 months of BC Hydro bills. Small businesses will be given a 3-month payment holiday, and there will be a 50% deferment for industries like pulp mills and mines. Hydro is also cutting rates by 1%. A crisis fund of up to $600 is also available for people who can't pay their hydro bills. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Parliament will soon be recalled. The objective is to make improvements to the government's emergency COVID-19 legislation. As David Thurton reports, the Conservatives are complaining the current stimulus package doesn't go far enough.
Canadians are looking for clarity and leadership. But what they have gotten from the Trudeau government is confusion and repeated delays.
Opposition leader Andrew Scheer is criticizing the government's COVID-19 response, specifically the wage subsidy for hard-hit businesses. Scheer says emergency legislation passed last week doesn't allow for expanding the payroll parachute to more employers or improving the eligibility criteria.
They should have made sure that they were getting it right.
The Prime Minister responded.
This is the largest economic program in Canada's history. This must be a Team Canada effort.
Justin Trudeau says opposition parties will be consulted about bringing back the House to tweak the legislation, which could happen as early as next week. David Thurton, CBC News, Ottawa.
The number of coronavirus cases in Canada is now more than 9,500 with 111 deaths. But Health Minister Patty Hajdu warns the numbers don't paint the whole picture.
It's important to remember that many people in all parts of the country are currently waiting on lab results, or they simply haven't been tested. So if you are not hearing about cases in your community, it doesn't mean that they don't exist. And for that reason, people must stay the course and practice social and physical distancing and follow the local and national public health advice no matter where you are or no matter how many cases there are or aren't in your community.
Meanwhile, there have been more than 30,000 deaths from COVID-19 across Europe, and that number is rising fast. In Spain's capital, a procession of vans carrying coffins of victims from a local nursing home. That country alone has seen more than 9,000 deaths and more than 100,000 infections. The number is even higher in Italy, with more than 13,000 fatalities. U.S. officials are closely watching what's happening there.
We think Italy may be the most comparable area to the United States at this point.
Vice President Mike Pence says the White House projections show the virus may spread in a similar way in the U.S. If that happens, medical officials there forecast 100,000 to 240,000 deaths. The Quebec government has restricted all non-essential travel to Western Quebec, and that includes all traffic from Ontario. The move is part of the province's strategy to slow the spread of the virus. Hilary Johnstone has more from the Portage Group.
Now, police in Quebec are expected to enforce this with targeted checkpoints. However, the government has not said yet what penalties there might be. There are people who are going to be exempt from this. That includes healthcare workers, humanitarian supports, and people needed to keep the supply chain running. Those people will be allowed to cross from Ontario into Western Quebec. Now, police here on the Ontario side of the border say that they have no plan to enforce people coming from Western Quebec into Ontario, but they are urging people to avoid all non-essential travel from Ontario into Quebec and from Quebec into Ontario. Hilary Johnstone, CBC News, Ottawa.
And that's the CBC News from Vancouver. For all the coronavirus updates, go to our website at cbc.ca/peace.
Rob, thank you very much. Hello there. I'm Gloria Makarenko, and on the coast is broadcasting out of my son's bedroom today in Vancouver. Yes, I'm working from home as well. You're listening to CBC Radio 1, and we are just waiting for Dr. Bonnie Henry and the Minister of Health, Adrian Dix, to begin their daily COVID-19 update. We will take you live to that feed in Victoria as soon as it happens. And we want to welcome listeners from the interior as well. Today, Radio West is going to be on air at its regular time right after the national news at 4 o'clock. Along with me is Lisa Christensen, way across town now. I have a completely different idea of what you're dealing with when we're not face-to-face in the studio, and still pretty comfortable and still pretty amazing what technology can do, Lisa.
It is, isn't it? And it was nice to see you this morning. We did our video conference call, so we got to see what everyone's doing, or just at least everyone's heads, that kind of part. So that was nice to see everyone. But broadcasting from home is a whole different situation, hey?
Now, we were talking yesterday on the program. People were sharing sort of family dishes and things that were favorites that they were trying to either recreate, as so many people are eating at home now, preparing meals at home. We got some great recipes, and I talked about a friend of mine who had made a tuna casserole, and you were inspired by that?
Yeah, I just made one for lunch today.
How did it turn out?
It turned out way better than I remembered, and now I can't stop eating it. I think it's the combination of the melted cheese and the broken up potato chips all over the top, and now it's just sitting there. And as you know, there means 2 feet away where I'm sitting. My desk is from the kitchen, so in case you hear some odd chewing sounds, it's just me digging in again. It's a very big recipe.
And it takes a whole different level of control when you are working from home. The refrigerator isn't that far away. You don't necessarily have the same, structured set hours, even though we have our regular meetings online. The temptation is always there, isn't it?
Oh, it is really there. Yeah, I think after this week, I'm going to have to come up with a bit more of a structure rather than just sort of eating when I want. That hasn't turned out to be probably as successful. I had an idea that I had some portion control. I do not have portion control, Gloria. That is something I'm not good at.
Something else besides the great recipes and pictures of people having, dinner online with their friends across town or across the country, that type of thing. We also celebrated Herb Alpert's 85th birthday yesterday. We got a great email that greeted us from one of our listeners. I'll just read you part of it. Leslie writes, I walked into my kitchen yesterday. I turned on the radio to CBC as usual and listened to Herb Albert. I'd love to tell you the rest of the story, but right now we're going to take you live to Victoria, bringing our total number of people who have tested positive to 1,066. 1066. That includes 497 people in Vancouver Coastal Health, 367 in the Fraser Health region, 72 people here on Vancouver Island, 114 now in Interior Health, and 16 in Northern Health.
In addition, we're up to 21 long-term care or assisted living facility outbreaks. And I mentioned yesterday that our number of outbreaks has increased quite a bit. We had 19 yesterday, but that really there are two major outbreaks and that we have learned quite a lot from them, particularly the Lynn Valley Care Center. And so there is a very low threshold for testing people in long-term care, both residents and staff, and even a single staff case or resident case is treated like an outbreak, is managed very aggressively as an outbreak. And I was noted yesterday that we are no longer listing the names, but they will be available on the statement so that you know exactly which facilities have been affected so far. In terms of the outbreaks, the Lynn Valley Care Center continues to have ongoing issues with 2 new cases identified, although the measures in place there are now, we hope, beginning to take effect. It just really reflects the challenging situation when you have transmission ongoing in a facility and the importance of catching these really early. For most of the other ones, it's a single person who has been identified, and the measures so far seem to be mostly effective. I will say we now have 142 test positive cases who are hospitalized around the province, and of those, 67 are currently in critical care, either in the intensive care unit or the high acuity units. We have had 1 additional death in the Fraser Valley region, bringing our total people who have succumbed to 25 in the province. We also now have up to 606 people who have been fully recovered and are no longer requiring isolation. There was a couple of things that I have mentioned over the past couple of weeks, one of which is that we have been working on and have developed an ethics framework for our response to COVID-19, and there are several different parts of it. There's an overall framework and a worksheet or a workbook approach that allows us to address a number of different questions, and that framework is now posted publicly on the BC CDC, the Government of BC website, on my Provincial Health Officer website links, but under the COVID response links on the government.gov.bc.ca website. As well, we posted the ethical framework around duty to care that comes out of the large framework, and one on the allocation of personal protective equipment. And that is the framework that we have been using to ensure that we maximize the resources that we have to best protect people in our healthcare system. We also are, and I've mentioned this in the past, have developed an ethical framework around allocation of scarce resources, things like ventilators. And part of that is a structure for how those decisions will be made so that no single individual clinician or healthcare worker will have to make those entirely terrible decisions on their own, that it will be done within a framework that respects the value of every individual life. That one is in the final phases of completion and will be posted publicly as well when it's ready. I just wanted to reflect a little bit on our discussions yesterday. And as we talked about yesterday, this is a very challenging time for us. It's hard to know how things are going to go. Right now, we seem to be holding our own. But without a doubt, we will get through this. We will get through this no matter what happens. But we do have a few more weeks to go. Our goal is to have these restrictions that we put in place and the orders that we put in place for as short a time as possible. But we also need to be mindful that we need to increase our activities in society in a way that is not going to tip us over an edge or increase the number of people who are becoming infected with this disease. So it needs to be done in a very thoughtful way. And I want people to know that we have been thinking of this. We've been thinking about all the possibilities that might happen in the coming weeks and months, and of course learning from the experiences around the globe. We are more committed. The more committed we are right now,
the less those outside of healthcare will need to do later. And I think it's incredibly important for us now to maintain our strong social connections at a distance. It's one of the best ways that we can take care of ourselves and our families and our communities. And there's a lot of examples that I've been seeing over the last couple of weeks and days. And the things that make me smile and make me realize that we are going to get through this together. One of them, of course, is the 7 p.m. cheer that we get. And my neighborhood does that too. We go out there with our pots and pans. Things like people leaving flowers and groceries on the doorstep for their neighbors and how appreciated that is. We have been seeing young children having virtual kindergarten and virtual play dates. And I know more of the virtual teaching and learning will be happening in the coming days. Evening gaming marathons with teens. I mean, my young people in my life tell me how much, they get to do stuff that before they used to have limits on. But you know what? These are the things that keep young people together too. We know there's stories of history teachers working with students to document their experiences during this extraordinary time. And I think that's something that we need to think about. The things that we're spending time on now and what this will mean for us in the future. We've seen more people with friends and family chats on using social media, using video, using FaceTime than we've ever had before. And then there's some really interesting things like the Canadian flour mills are working 24/7 right now because hundreds of loaves of fresh bread are bought on Instagram every day, which is kind of different and good for us. And there are many other examples of people doing the right thing now. You know, the other parts that we're seeing is community collaboration and businesses and communities wanting to contribute. We've had hundreds of offers of support, many of which have come into me in my personal email. Not that I've been able to answer them all, but I have forwarded them on to many of the great team that we have that are looking at what we can use and how we can use the support of people in our community to keep people safe. So we also have direct donations from a lot of great companies like Safe Care BC. And it was announced earlier today, there's now the COVID-19 Supply Hub, where we can collaborate, we can tell people what we need, and government and businesses around the province can contribute to that. So I think that's a great way for now to try and work on this together and solve these problems together. So these donations, these offers of help, and these many, many examples of community connection really do show me that we will get through this, and we'll get through this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Henry. As Dr. Henry has said, 53 more cases of COVID-19 today, and a number of more people in hospital, a number of more people in ICU, and one more death. And we wanted to pass on to the families and friends and the caregivers of that person and the 25 people who passed away from COVID-19 in BC. Our condolences, our thoughts are with all of you. I wanted to talk briefly about some of the issues in acute care, just to keep you up to date on where we stand today. We have today about 4,192 beds, empty beds in acute care in British Columbia. That represents 61% capacity in our acute care system as it stands today. We've added capacity, and of course, there's been a significant reduction in population in acute care hospitals. Equally, about 55.5% of our critical care beds are occupied right now in acute care hospitals. Just to put in context what's happening out there in the system, you see that people are using healthcare for other reasons less at the moment. This is for a number of reasons. We have, for example, seen a decline in regular ambulance calls. The past most recent day went out 311 against an average of 1,540 in an ordinary time or the pre-COVID time. Equally, there are fewer emergency room visits right now. On March the 9th, that was 3 weeks ago, on Monday, I believe,
There was 6,559 emergency room visits in BC. As of March 30th, 3 weeks later, there were 3,274, which is significantly less. We want to continue to thank all of the people who are working in healthcare, who are also all of the essential workers that are ensuring that our grocery stores have food and supplies, that are doing that work that involves truckers and grocery store workers. I want to especially express our appreciation to them and all the people working every day in healthcare. I think this is a moment, the Premier said it last night, Dr. Henry said it very clearly again today, and I think every day, that this is the time we have to be 100% all in on all of the measures that have been taken. I want to just focus briefly today on one of those measures, which I think is significant and which faces us. As many of you know, initially when we did our testing and when we were dealing with the initial cases around COVID-19, they involved principally travel to Canada from other places. And that was a focus of our effort to ensure that those, the possible links of transmission were broken and that we would slow the spread of the disease at that time. As you know, there are tens of thousands of Canadians now registered with Global Affairs Canada, Canadian passport holders, many of them looking to come home from other countries. And the Government of Canada is engaging in significant efforts to ensure that they're brought home. And I want to say this, first of all, that the Government of Canada did an extraordinary job in organizing an evacuation of Canadians from Wuhan. Everyone, as you'll remember, went to Trenton, Ontario. Nobody who was evacuated became sick with COVID-19. Equally, in the case of the Diamond Princess, which came from Japan, people who cleared the ship who were not sick came back, I think in that case, to Cornwall, Ontario. And the Government of Canada, again, no one got sick, and that was an extraordinary logistical effort from the Government of Canada, which I'm sure we all appreciate. We'll also note that people came from the Grand Princess, which is off the coast of California. And on the Grand Princess, a number of people did get sick. They were quarantined. They did come home and were quarantined. The Prime Minister said today that, and I'm quoting him, I can tell you that the entirety of Global Affairs Canada employees are single-mindedly focused on this Herculean task of bringing Canadians home any way we can. And much of it involves negotiating with other countries to get permission for cruise ships to dock, permissions for airplanes to lift off from the country where they closed airspace, etc. And we know of these efforts and the flights that are coming back and so on. And I think it gives us a chance to reflect on two things. One, our responsibilities as governments in that context, and one, our responsibilities as people. And the first thing I would want to note is our responsibility as people. And there are no exceptions to this, not one, not a single one. But for someone who would come back on such a flight, especially one organized by the Government of Canada, to their absolute requirement to self-isolate when they get back to Canada. And there can be no ambiguity about this fact. It would be, I think, a real betrayal of the people in your community to not follow those rules, which are, by the way, also the law at the federal level and the order at the provincial level. And that's our responsibility. Everyone who comes home, everybody who comes home has to understand that and follow those rules. That is one of the ways that all of the efforts of the millions of people in British Columbia and the tens of millions of people in Canada will be supported when people come home. That's their obligation. And I think there's an obligation as well, whether it be at YVR or whether it be for people coming back from sun destinations to airports like Kelowna, to ensure that they are met with a very significant presence. There can be no ambiguity anymore, if there ever was, about people's obligations when they get home. No ambiguity